Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a second year PhD student here at Newcastle. Today I'm going to be talking about the Galapagos Giant Tortoises. So first, a bit of an overview. So the Galapagos Islands are located roughly 1,000 kilometres west off the coast of Ecuador, and they were established as a national park in 1959. So this protects more than 3,000 square miles of land across 13 of the main islands and hundreds of the islets, as well as covering 50,000 square miles of the ocean as well. So a lot of you have probably heard of the Galapagos Islands, and it's most famous for Charles Darwin's visit on the HMS Beagle in 1835. And this helped him to develop his theory of evolution. When he was observing the finches and the mockingbirds across the different islands, he noticed that they have slightly different beak shapes across all the different islands, and this helped lead him to his theory later on. Conservation is really important in the Galapagos Islands because it's home to unique characteristic species, some of which you might be familiar with. So down the left here, we have a blue-footed booby, and we have two native iguanas, so the marine iguana and the land iguana. The Galapagos also has its own species of penguin, and then of course the giant tortoise, which I'm going to talk about today. The Galapagos Giant Tortoises are a lineage of 14 species distributed across 10 of the major islands. Most islands only have one species, so in this map here, the capitalized name is the island. Each volcano is given as well, and the name of the species below the island. So we have 3 extinct species currently, Pinta, Floreana, and Santa Fe, and we also have one species that exists just as a lone individual, so it's functionally extinct in the wild, and that's Fernandina. So the tortoises are important in their ecosystem because they're engineers within their environment. So this means that they provide function. So for example, they eat the prickly pear cactus, they move across the land, and they deposit the seeds, which helps regenerate the cactus across the landscape. They also make these tracks, so a tortoise will return to the same land over and over and kind of trample everything in its way, and this helps kind of keep the vegetation down and allow other animals to cross as well. So we have 2 main morphologies of tortoise. The first is the dome, so it has this really kind of dome shape. And then on the right-hand side, we have this saddleback. You can see it's got this really distinct ridge, and this will come important later. I've also highlighted here the Floreana island that we're going to be talking about later as well. So why are they declining and why are they endangered? This all started in roughly the 1700s. So when sailors first arrived in the islands, they heavily exploited the tortoises for meat, oil, and water. And you can see, it's quite hard to see, but these are shells across the landscape here, and these are left after destruction of humans. So this isn't a recent thing. This has been going on for hundreds of years. And then more recently, humans also brought invasive species, and these are more hard to control. So here we have the goat, and what these do is they eat all the vegetation, leaving nothing for the tortoises. We also have this rat, and this was actually taken when I was on the Galapagos Islands. It's not hard to spot a rat. And these eat the tortoise eggs, as well as juveniles kind of below 5 years old. So they're really problematic. And we also have domestic cat. Here this is carrying a marine iguana, but you can imagine the same kind of effect that it will have for the tortoises as well. So the Floreana Island tortoise. I mentioned earlier that it's extinct, and one of the reasons is because of where it lies within the islands. So when sailors were arriving on the Galapagos, this is one of the first port of calls they would arrive to. Also, very uniquely, it has what's called a post office barrel on this island. So sailors would arrive with their letters, put it in the post office barrel, and then sailors coming around would then pick it back up, see if there was any going to where they were going, and then distribute them across the world. So Floreana was really very popular for sailors, and this meant that the tortoise population there was really prone to harvesting. We kind of get an idea of this in the early 1800s. Some of the really old log books from the ships detail the number of tortoises that were taken. So during this 25-year period, there was at least 3,000 tortoises taken, and it's quite a small island. So you can imagine the devastation that that caused. Later on, in 1846, HMS Earl visited, and the naturalists on board said that there was no terrapin or terrapin living. And this leads us to believe that probably 1846 to 1850 is the likely extinction period. And we estimate this is probably from roughly 12,500 tortoises, all lost. So yeah, all we have left of this species is museum records. However, in 2005, explorers were on Volcano Wolf Island, on Isabella Island, and they discovered these tortoises living there that had this really unique shell shape. So the native species is domed, and they found these, which have the distinct saddleback carapace. So they collected blood samples, and they took them away to the lab, and they compared them with all of the living species, and they couldn't find a match for what these were. They then thought to include the 3 extinct species, so Pinta, Floreana, and Santa Fe, and they then discovered that these individuals on Volcano Wolf were actually hybrids of Floreana and the native Volcano Wolf species. So their genome is 50-50 or 75-25, some sort of mix between Volcano Wolf and Floreana. So this is really unusual because the islands are really far apart. There's no current that flows this way. Tortoises can't swim, so there's no natural dispersal route for them to get from Floreana to Volcano Wolf. So this leads us to believe that probably when they were picked up in Floreana, they were then deposited later on by humans on Volcano Wolf, probably in the 17 to 1800s, and they've been left there ever since to interbreed with the native population there, which has left us with this really unique situation where we have a genomic archive of an extinct species. So what does this mean? As I said before, they're ecosystem engineers, so Floreana Island has been really desiccated by the goats, and since the tortoises haven't been there, there's been no one to restore the island for roughly 200 years. So when the hybrids were identified, this brought about the possibility of reintroducing a similar species from the native back onto the island that will help restore the processes. And this is in line with the Galapagos Conservancy, who are working on a much broader scale to help rewild Floreana. They're also trying to reintroduce mockingbirds and things like that as well. So how does genetics come into this? So the captive breeding program is genetically managed, and it has 2 main aims. The first of which is to manage parent pairs so that breeding tortoises have the highest level of ancestry to the ancestral Floreana. I'm not going to talk about that today though. I'm mostly going to focus on how we monitor the contribution of each breeder to ensure that the population is genetically diverse. We don't want the offspring to be inbred, and we want them to have as much diversity as possible so that when they're reintroduced, they can better adapt. So how did they do this? Well, they got a helicopter and a ship, and the individuals identified with Floreana ancestry were taken from the volcano and transported to a specialised captive breeding centre on another island on the Galapagos. So the captive breeding centre looks like this. They're essentially in what's called a breeding corral. So it's kind of like an enclosure, but instead of a fence, they have just these stone walls. And it's very sandy, filled with cactus and vegetation, and they also have a nesting area. So this is exactly like the conditions they would lay eggs in the wild. So they then took an approach to the captive breeding program to kind of start small. So of the individuals they collected, they took 5 females and 3 males, and they put them all inside the same corral, just to see what would happen for 4 years. This allowed them to kind of refine the captive breeding conditions. There's not much literature on how to captively breed a Galapagos Giant Tortoise, so over this time they kind of managed that. And they managed to get 130 viable offspring just from these 3 breeding seasons, so it was quite successful. Then in 2017, they increased the number of males and females, and they also spread them across breeding corrals. So rather than having them all in one, they took them and separated them, and they had 3 females and 2 males in each. And this is based on kind of aggression observations from the previous. And from that, they had 98 offspring. So what they then did was take blood samples from all of the offspring, as well as blood samples from all of the breeders, and genotype them. So we then had a DNA sequence for every single individual within the captive breeding program. And then we compared them to the parent pairs to the offspring. So what this graph shows is the number of offspring is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have male and female pairs. Now this is a bit hard to read, so I've tried to highlight the main results here. So we have females are first, and then males are second. So here in the kind of pilot phase, you can see that the male starred in red, BR877. He had offspring with multiple females, so he was quite successful that year. And then so was BR6110. So these two males contributed most of the offspring within the pilot when they were all in the same corral. And then when they were split up into the 4 separate corrals where there was only 2 males per breeding enclosure, you can see that the male BR877, who previously had mated with multiple females and had lots of offspring, didn't breed. And the same for BR6110. And we also had a similar situation in the 3rd corral where only 1 male contributed offspring. In the 4th corral, we had both males contribute offspring, but the second one was very low. So what does this tell us? So using this kind of genetic tool to look at breeders and offspring within the captive breeding program, we can help measure how diverse the population is. Because we didn't have all of the possible breeders contributing offspring, it's not as diverse as it could have been. However, there is still a lot of diversity in there through all of the females contributing. It also allowed us to better understand how the tortoises behave in captivity, seeing how they deal with multiple mate choices, and allows us to plan better for the future. So yeah, in January of next year, they will be rearranged into different groups, and they'll breed for a further 3 seasons. And yeah, we're currently also looking to reduce the number of breeders that we have. This is a male that has escaped. He's climbed the stone wall of his corral, and he's escaped because he's not happy with the people he's been kept with. So we have to sterilize some of them to stop things like this happening. So how do we go about releasing the tortoises? As I said before, the overall plan is to have a stable population that we can then repatriate back onto Floreana Island. However, there's lots of things we have to consider before we can do this. So I mentioned before the rats. There has been an attempt at an eradication program on Floreana. However, it's not entirely certain if all of the rats are gone. So there's still a threat to juvenile and hatchling tortoises. The devastation by goats remains. So as you can see, there's not a lot of vegetation in this patch. So they have to really consider where to put the tortoises. There's also quite a high human population in Floreana, so they think it's between 140 and 200 people, and they're all farmers. So they have to think about how human-wildlife conflict might come into play. As you can see here in this farm, the tortoises don't mind being in with the cows. However, the farmers might not like that, so they have to consider that. And then, most worryingly of all, this was earlier this summer, the Ecuadorian Navy intercepted a boat that was carrying juvenile tortoises from the Galapagos. So these have been stolen from the islands, probably for the illegal wildlife trade. And this is still a massive problem that's ongoing, so we need to be sure that when we repatriate the tortoises, things like this aren't going to happen to them, and they're not going to end up just getting wiped out again. So in summary, generally, when you hear of hybridization between species, it's a red flag. However, the hybrids that exist on Volcano Wolf are quite a unique case because they're these genomic archives of an extinct species. With managed captive breeding led by genomics, there's this opportunity to increase representation of an extinct species. We're not going to fully bring it back, but we're going to try and increase as much as possible. And the chance to rewild a lost ecosystem on Floreana as well. And yeah, given all of the anthropogenic changes to wildlife habitats, hybrid zones are more likely in the future, so more cases like this where we see species intermixing are likely to arise. So yeah, thank you for listening. I'll take any questions.